Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character.
Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday to you on this August 20th, 2025, and welcome back to another Ride to Work Rush Hour breakdown where we sift through the noise, the drama, the scandals, the tragedies, and the absolute nonsense that manages to clog up our timelines and fuel those inevitable water cooler conversations, because whether we want to or not, these are the stories that everybody ends up talking about. From the heartbreaking to the absurd, from families falling apart in courtrooms to NFL fans freaking out about men in tight shorts dancing on the sidelines. And believe me, today's lineup has everything, so buckle up, grab your coffee and let's jump in, starting with what can only be described as an absolute nightmare of a case, the alleged kidnapping of a 7-month-old baby boy named Emmanuel Harrow. A story that gripped people all weekend with its gut-wrenching twists and now, as of just hours ago, is taking a turn many suspected but few wanted to believe. Because when you first hear a parent crying on camera about their missing child, your heart goes out to them instantly, but then the police come in, poke at the details, find some cracks, and suddenly the entire narrative begins to shift from sympathetic to suspicious. And the mother's desperate plea for her son's safe return becomes entangled with words like inconsistencies and refuse to cooperate. And that alone is enough to turn a community's hope into skepticism. And what we know so far is that Emmanuel, just 7 months old, was reportedly snatched in a Big 5 parking lot in Yucaipa, California, while his mom Rebecca claimed she had stopped to pick up a mouthguard for her stepson who was playing youth football. She said she realized the baby needed a diaper change. And that's when, according to her initial statement, someone attacked her and ran off with her baby, a horrifying story on its face. But soon after, investigators began noticing holes, things that didn't add up, contradictions in her timeline, parts of her testimony that sounded rehearsed or implausible. And when law enforcement pressed her for clarification, she allegedly refused to continue answering questions, lawyered up, and together with her husband effectively shut down cooperation, which to many people looks less like innocent parents protecting their rights and more like people with something to hide. Though of course we must say innocent until proven guilty, but try telling that to the commenters online who from day one smelled something rotten, people who have followed too many cases of so-called kidnappings that later turned out to be cover-ups for tragic or sinister family actions, and you could practically see the tide shift in real time, first sympathy pouring in, then doubt creeping in, then outright suspicion, with some even speculating about postpartum psychosis, mental health breakdowns, or darker family secrets. And to make matters even messier, the grandmother confirmed the couple is no longer cooperating with investigators, intensifying speculation that this case may be more than just a kidnapping, that perhaps foul play from within the family itself is in question. And it's just brutal to process because at the center of all of this is still a missing 7-month-old child, a baby who did not ask for any of this chaos. And whether it ends up being an abduction, an accident, or something more sinister, the public is left with this heavy feeling that the story won't have a happy ending, and we'll be tracking every turn of it, even though part of me, like many of you, hopes against hope that somehow we're wrong, that the baby will be found safe. Though in my gut, after years of covering these stories, I'm bracing for the worst, because the moment the parents shut down cooperation, the odds of a miracle rescue begin to plummet. Now, shifting gears because we can't linger too long on the bleakest corners of humanity without going crazy, let's talk about something entirely different, though equally messy in its own way. The culture wars brewing around NFL cheerleading squads, because apparently the end of preseason wasn't dramatic enough, and people needed something new to argue about online. So cue the outrage over the Minnesota Vikings introducing 2 male cheerleaders to their dance squad, a move that by most rational measures should be a non-story but has somehow exploded into yet another woke versus tradition battlefield, with half the internet screaming, "Not on my team," and "Keep men off the sidelines," while the other half cheers on the inclusion, applauding the athleticism, the diversity, and frankly the fact that male cheerleaders have existed for decades, particularly in college programs where stunts and lifts require male bases. But NFL fans, being NFL fans, have managed to turn it into a culture war spectacle, some calling it emasculating, some making homophobic remarks, others clapping back by pointing out the inherent homoerotic undertones of football itself. Quarterbacks with hands snug under the center's backside, linemen slapping each other on the rear after a play, massive men in tights grappling in the mud. But suddenly 2 guys dancing on the sideline is where the line must be drawn. Give me a break. And honestly, it says far more about the insecurities of the complainers than it does about the cheerleaders themselves, because if you're so threatened by a dude in glitter shaking his hips to a pop remix, maybe the problem isn't the NFL going woke. Maybe the problem is your own fragile sense of masculinity. And look, the truth is most people don't even watch the cheerleaders at the games. By the time the sideline performance starts, half the stadium is on TikTok grabbing snacks or screaming at the refs. But because the internet thrives on outrage, the small fraction of people who care have gotten their hot takes boosted to the top of the feed, creating the illusion of a giant controversy when really it's just noise. And my stance is simple. Who cares? Let people dance, bring some variety, maybe even bring new fans into the stadium. And if anything, it makes me wonder if there's an age cap, because I've still got a couple moves left in me if they'll let me audition. Just gotta stretch the hamstrings first before I throw out my back trying to hit a TikTok dance. When it comes to Laura Owens and her situation, I've said it before and I'll say it again. We've been calling this out for a long time, long before most people even started paying attention to her and the circus surrounding her attorney David Gingries, who has a reputation that precedes him in the most chaotic way imaginable, a man described as reckless, a loose cannon who doesn't care about professional consequences, possibly unstable, and there are even whispers about him being under the influence in public appearances, with one notorious story suggesting he even brandished a gun during one of his video rants, which, if true, shows you the level of volatility we're dealing with here. And yet despite this, my stance remains the same. I won't be silenced, I won't back down, and I won't play into their tactics of intimidation, because silence is exactly what people like Owens and her lawyer would prefer from those who are speaking up. But giving in would mean handing them the control they're desperate for, so instead I'm doubling down, standing firm, and reminding my audience that I am a star witness in this ongoing mess. And whether or not Owens' attorney contacting me directly, which, let's be honest, he shouldn't even be doing before a case, ends up leading to repercussions remains to be seen. But one thing's certain. I'm not hiding. I'll continue to report on this until I'm legally obligated to pause during trial weeks. And with that update given, let's pivot into the even wilder saga involving Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively, and the emerging involvement of actress Isabela Ferrer, whose name has been tossed around in ways that are almost surreal, considering her relatively minor role in the film. At the heart of this controversy, It Ends With Us, where she briefly played the younger version of Blake Lively's character and spent only 4 days on set, yet has somehow found herself being dragged into the center of subpoenas, legal filings, and allegations of harassment that stretch beyond reasonable proportions, because Baldoni's side attempted to subpoena her, a move she and her legal team framed as harassment designed to draw her unwillingly into litigation she's tried to avoid. And in her several-page legal response, she argues that Baldoni and his affiliated entities have manipulated, threatened, and attempted to control her, even citing that his team once referenced a completely fabricated case, an AI hallucination, within their legal arguments, which, if accurate, is not only sloppy but bizarre in a high-stakes court battle of this magnitude. Though to be fair, AI-generated nonsense has been creeping into filings elsewhere in the legal system, so it isn't entirely shocking but is certainly embarrassing. And Isabela claims that this all amounts to Baldoni weaponizing process and press coverage to create havoc for her as a young actress, with her counsel demanding that not only should his motions be denied but that sanctions should be levied against him for sharp practice, while she simultaneously asserts that she is owed indemnity under her contract as a weekly player for the film, meaning that the production company It Ends With Us LLC was supposed to protect her from legal exposure tied to her work on set. But in her eyes they've failed to honor that duty, leaving her stuck in this crossfire between Baldoni and Blake Lively's camps. And though she insists she's being bullied, the reality is that her actual role and involvement in the film were minimal, which makes her inflated legal positioning seem a bit theatrical, as if she's leaning into the narrative of being a pivotal victim when really she was a 4-day supporting player who sent the typical texts of gratitude to a director after wrapping, thanking him, sharing set photos, saying how much she enjoyed working with him, messages that Baldoni's camp then presented in their complaint to show she had no issue with him at the time, contrasting her warm words with her later silence once she became aligned with Blake Lively during promotions. And while her lawyers spin this as Baldoni appropriating her narrative without permission, the fact remains that such texts are commonplace in Hollywood, polite flattery often masking mixed feelings, just as comics tell club owners loved the venue when they hated it, because the industry runs on egos and reputations. And yet Isabella's filing escalates things dramatically, accusing Baldoni of behavior that mimics a harasser and framing his attempt to serve her with a subpoena as bullying, which is quite a stretch given the function of subpoenas in litigation. But her positioning clearly signals that she's siding herself with Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds in this war, hitching her wagon to their influence, which makes sense given the Hollywood calculus of aligning with the more powerful side, but still leaves one to wonder if she knows something the public doesn't or if she's simply protecting her career by not crossing Blake. And what makes this even murkier is the backdrop of the smear campaign narrative. Because while Blake Lively alleged a premeditated campaign by Baldoni and his allies to discredit her, the timing doesn't fully align, as those supposed smears only gained traction after the lawsuits and after the explosive New York Times article painted Baldoni as problematic, at which point his team naturally began issuing statements to defend him. Something any lawyer would do, so the argument becomes circular. Was there really a coordinated smear campaign? Or was it just defense in the face of Blake's aggressive takeover of the film and PR machine? And that takeover is a whole scandal in itself, with reports that she locked Baldoni out of the editing room, forced herself into the creative credit, sidelined the original team to a literal basement during the premiere, and pushed through her vision only to have her own directorial efforts flop critically before she had to stitch back together 90% of Baldoni's original work. All while leveraging behind-the-scenes pressure like the infamous 17-point agreement she allegedly forced him to sign, essentially holding his career and reputation hostage in exchange for her cooperation in finishing the film, and depending on how charitable one wants to be, that could be framed as either a power move to salvage a project she believed he was mishandling or as outright sabotage born of insecurity and ambition. But either way it undercuts the notion that she was ever truly endangered by him on set. Because if she felt harassed or unsafe, would she really have remained so comfortably involved through post-production, editing, and PR before orchestrating his exclusion? Or was that narrative retroactively constructed to justify the power grab? And this is where the pro-Blake side and the pro-Baldoni side diverge completely, each interpreting the same events through their own experiences and biases, with Blake supporters emphasizing the optics of actors unfollowing Baldoni en masse. A move that in Hollywood can be as damning as a lawsuit itself, signaling social exile, while Baldoni's defenders emphasize the lack of hard evidence of harassment, no texts, no emails, no contemporaneous reports that back up Blake's more severe insinuations, and instead only see contrived HR complaints, like the bizarre claim that he stood so close during makeup that his breath required them to redo her face. A complaint so flimsy it sounds like parody, and yet circulated online by pro-Blake accounts as if it were damning proof, when really it was just smoke without fire. And in this entire tangled mess, Isabela Ferrer has become a pawn, her legal filing puffed up with accusations of harassment, manipulation, and AI hallucinated citations, while at the same time reminding the court she was only on set 4 days, which undermines her own dramatization of being central to Baldoni's supposed misconduct. And so the question becomes whether she truly believes she was bullied or whether she's amplifying her victimhood narrative as a strategic career move, because aligning with Blake and Ryan might ensure future opportunities in their powerful circle, while siding with Baldoni, now branded toxic in certain media circles, could be a career killer for an up-and-coming actress. And yet, as this drags on, it's not just Isabela whose credibility is in question but everyone's, because the longer the fight stretches, the harder it becomes to even pinpoint the original grievance, whether Blake was justified in seizing control of the film, whether Baldoni was genuinely mistreating people or simply steamrolled by a star with more leverage, and whether the so-called smear campaign was real or just reactive PR. But the one undeniable truth is that every player here is acting out of self-interest. Blake to cement her creative authority, Ryan to protect his wife and their brand, Isabela to preserve her rising trajectory, Baldoni to salvage his reputation and authorship, and even journalists and creators like me to dissect the madness for audiences, because this spectacle has ballooned beyond a simple dispute into a full-blown Hollywood war of egos, reputations and narratives, where legal filings read like gossip columns and gossip columns read like legal filings, and the public is left to sift through contradictory stories, biased leaks, and performative outrage while asking the simplest question of all. Where's the actual evidence of the alleged harassment, the text to Ryan Reynolds, the emails of discomfort, the concrete proof that Baldoni crossed lines on set? Because until that surfaces, what we're really seeing is less a story of victimhood and more a battle of control, power and narrative, and for Isabela caught in the crossfire the irony is rich. Her 4 days on set may become the most consequential days of her career, not for what she filmed, but for the legal storm they've dragged her into, a storm she claims is harassment, Baldoni claims is due diligence, Blake frames as justice, and the public can only watch unfold with popcorn disbelief and exhaustion at how far this has spiraled from the making of a simple film into one of the messiest Hollywood scandals of recent memory, where every side insists they are the true victim, every filing is laced with strategy, and every day the question remains unanswered. Was this ever really about harassment or was it always about power? Thanks for watching. Subscribe my channel Coravanta. Bye besties. Goodbye.